I think that we can start. So good day or good afternoon, dear participants. We are glad to welcome you here at our open lecture. And we're really grateful for you for sharing all the time today, for being here today, for getting interest into our work. So today we represent the International Foundation for Electoral Systems in Ukraine. IFES has been working in Ukraine since 1994, and they were working in different directions and different aspects of the electoral reform and political financing. One of the most important aspects of our work is actually enforcing the participation of women in political and electoral processes. And today we have the honor to have the international expert, Dr. Gabrielle Bardall, who has a lot of experience, extensive experience in working in the electoral support and working in gender issues connected to the elections and politics. She's about to tell us about an important part of her work, speaking on violence against women in politics. So I would like to pass the floor to Gabrielle. Thank you for your attention.
Spasiba daya. Hello, and thank you for coming today. It is a pleasure to be with you here in Kyiv. Again, my name is Gabrielle Bardall, and I am the Senior Gender Specialist, with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, and I'm also a Research Fellow with the University of Ottawa. So, we're here today to talk about one of the most pervasive, significant, and also silent and hidden challenges that prevent women around the world, in the United States, in the Ukraine, around the world, from enjoying their human rights, their civil rights, their political rights, and participating in the political life of their country. This is the issue of violence and of harassment against women in elections. We're here today to talk about this issue, and particularly to talk about how digital technology, how information and communication technologies, ICTs, I'll call them today, impact this field. So, let's start with an example. This is a little article from France 24, French media service. Burundi opposition figure shot dead. Burundi, the small African country. A Burundian opposition figure and his bodyguard were shot in the capital by gunmen on Saturday. A civil society activist said protests against the president's third term. The attack occurred as tensions were growing ahead of the presidential and legislative elections. This is the type of article that you can see in many countries ahead of an election, during an election, and it's the first thing we think of when we think of election violence, right? In this case, who's the victim of election violence? It's a political party leader. You can answer, huh? The victim in this case is the leader of a political party and his bodyguard. Who was the perpetrator of the crime? We don't know. There was a gunman, a man with a gun. He came, he attacked, he shot, he killed these men. It happened. What type of violence is this? It's clear. It's a killing. It's an assassination. It took place in public, on a street, in front of this man's house. It happened clearly during the campaign period. It was visibly connected to the election. And where are we reading about it? In France 24. This is the international newspaper, right? This is a major media source. So, is this election violence? Sure. It definitely is election violence. This is what we always think of. This is the stereotype of election violence around the world. But let's take another example. So this here is testimony taken from a research interview that I conducted during the course of my field research. It says, this is a woman candidate who was telling her story. She says, during the last elections in my country, I decided to run for parliament. When I told him, my husband became furious. He pinched me, he beat me, he forced me in bed. He said this was to show me my place as his wife. He told me I was not fit to be a mother, and he took our children away. He brought them to his family's home, where I could not see them. He threatened to divorce me if I did not withdraw my candidacy. I began to have nightmares. I became very depressed. Also, my priest was angry with me for this decision. He told me God would punish me. I became afraid. He threw stones at me. I had many bruises and a broken leg. So in this case, who is the victim here? It's a candidate, again, like the last. But who was the perpetrator? Who committed the crime? The husband, the priest. You could also say maybe the in-laws, if they took the children from her and accepted that behavior. And what kind of violence is this? There's some physical violence, yeah? But what else? Eh? I heard an answer. Yeah, intimidation, threats, fear. There's sexual violence. This is domestic violence also. There's even some economic consequences, right? If this woman was forced to have a divorce, this has an impact on her well-being in general. And how was it reported on? It's not in France 24 this time. No. We heard about this incident by building some trust with this woman, by sitting down, by having a conversation with her in a private home, in an anonymous questionnaire where her identity is protected. This is not headline news. So do you think that this is also an act of election violence? Yeah, sure it is. What's different about these two cases? A lot of things, but they're actually quite similar, and they have a similar impact. The impact, first of all, is hurting the physical person, clearly, physical harm, and psychological and other. But it's also limiting that person's rights to participate in government, to participate in politics. And that has an amplified impact. Why? Because democracy is about participation, it's about inclusion, it's about diversity. And when any action is taken to inhibit that, you harm the quality of democracy. And when a violent action is taken to inhibit that, you seriously harm the quality of democracy. So it has an individual impact and a social impact. So what we're going to talk about today is the fact that both men and women experience political violence, electoral violence, but it takes many, many different shapes and different forms. It's a major challenge to women's participation in particular. It's often hidden. It takes place in many different locations, often that we don't think about. A lot of times there's a relationship that exists between the perpetrator and the victim when a woman is involved. That is not the case with men. And women become particularly vulnerable for a number of reasons that we're going to talk about, especially when we talk about ICTs. So just to give a quick overview of what we'll talk about, and I should ask, how long can I speak for? About an hour? Okay. Tell me when you want me to stop talking. One more. Okay. So in part one, the word VAWE, violence against women in elections. We're going to talk about what we know about this phenomenon based on the research. We know where it happens, we know when it happens, why it happens, the diversity of perpetrators of these crimes, who are the most common victims, the impacts, and we're also going to talk about what we don't know for this issue. And this is the first part. We're going to give an overview of the research in this field. And in the second part, we're going to talk about the very, very particular case of digital technology, because this is really where we see a huge growth in incidents of harassment, aggression, and violence against women, and it's something that is really not recognized well. So let's get started. Go ahead. All right. So, who here has studied comparative politics? Okay. So, I'm a comparative political science, a political scientist, and in political science we really like typologies. So, we're going to talk about this from a theoretical perspective now. Okay, I just told you some difficult stories, but let's think about this as a conceptual, theoretical phenomenon. So the types of violence against women in elections and in politics. You have physical violence and non-physical violence, right? Two very clear fields. Physical harm, in particular, we all can recognize. Sexual harm are physical types of violence. And then also the non-physical, psychological and emotional types of abuse, as well as economic. This is a really simple typology, and we're going to talk about some of the more poorly understood aspects of it. And just to remember, you know, we're saying violence against women in elections, violence against women in politics, but these things happen to men and to women, but they happen with different frequencies, they happen in different locations, and they happen with different impacts, and some of them are more common for women. So, physical violence is not limited to this case, right? This case in a poor African country, you know, has lots of physical violence, lots of things like this, but it also includes other types of physical violence. So it includes forms of violence that take place in the private sphere, as well as domestic forms of violence. And many types of violence that just happen more often to women and have therefore been overlooked. So domestic violence and politics, really? Why? It happens all of the time. It happens in every country in the world. Conflict starts at home. And when women in particular want to go against the traditional values of their family, maybe, the traditional roles, there's conflict that's generated. And sometimes that conflict turns into violence. In my research in the field, I've talked to many women, some of them very humble, poor worker women, who say they thought about voting for somebody different than their husband, than their father, and they get hurt. I've talked to women who are very high-level politicians, women who are Supreme Court judge in some countries. They've also experienced this problem, where conflict has occurred because maybe their husband or their father or their uncle wanted them to step back from their role and maybe to stop being a candidate or to step down from an elected position and hurt them physically because of that or sexually. So domestic violence does occur. It's very difficult to track. There's no hard data to measure it, but it does exist and it does create a serious impediment for women who are considering breaking with traditional roles and engaging in political life. We also talk about violence against internally displaced people and refugees. And so why do we care about this with women in particular? Well, again, it's men and women, but sometimes internally displaced people become the objects of abuse. How? In some cases, politicians will prolong the status and refuse to give the papers to displaced people as a political manipulation, but it has an impact on these people. They can force displaced people to move to different locations, which can cause a real hardship, including physical violence. They can prevent them from returning for political reasons again, and they can also manipulate registration papers, documentation, in order to either artificially increase or decrease participation for electoral reasons. This impacts women and children in particular, because worldwide 80% of internally displaced people and refugees are women and are children. So although it impacts both men and women, it has a disproportionate effect on women. Same thing with child abuse. We've seen cases of this. For example, the one where I mentioned. But if you use a child abuse situation to intimidate, to control, to disenfranchise a woman, to punish her, or to coerce her political participation and choices, this has created a political dimension to an otherwise private domestic form of violence. So We'll talk some about some sexual forms of violence against women in elections. So you see here some examples from around the world. The one case, Harass Map, was an initiative from, this one was Egypt, I think, where women were able to use cell phones to report in cases where they had been sexually attacked or assaulted during the protest movement that occurred in Tahrir Square. Many different types of violence, invitations, stalking people, catcalls, touching, all types of inappropriate sexual behavior. Women who were active in political life in the square were able to report on this. In another case, in the photo in the top, the police officers were violating the women protesters. They were arresting in many different ways, stripping them in public, and performing virginity tests on protesters that they had arrested in the square. So these women were exercising their political rights, they were demonstrating, they were protesting, but the punishment that they received, the violent interaction that they had with security forces had a sexual dimension to it. And this is what we talk about when we talk about violence against women in elections and in politics. So sexual violence, it occurs in public settings, such as the cases I've just talked about. Sexual violence also occurs in private spaces. Domestic rape has occurred in relation to the political activities I've just spoken about. And rape also happens in public settings in many countries in the world. In the last years, Kenya, Bangladesh, Cote d'Ivoire, all countries where women either were protesting in the streets peacefully during elections, along with men, or where they were otherwise involving in political activities, where police forces entered to disrupt these activities. They also got involved in mass rapes. In Cote d'Ivoire, reports of many women having this experience. In Bangladesh, more than 200 women were raped following elections in 2001. In Guinea, the same thing. There is, very sadly, a sexual dimension to this form of political violence. So we'll continue. So you can go ahead. We've talked about a number of different types of this violence, and what is striking by the research that exists, and the research is still flawed, this is still an emerging field, but some studies are showing that women experience psychological forms of violence, intimidation, threats, more than twice as often as men. If you're looking here, I can't read it, so I hope it's okay, but this high number on the left is the experience of women with psychological violence, and men was a much less proportion. But on the other hand, we see that men are experiencing almost 3 times the amount of physical violence in elections, which has its own consequences and impacts. So what we're showing with this graph really is that there's a difference, is that the types of election violence that men and women experience are really very different, and that women's experience with election violence, with political violence, is overwhelmingly connected to these more less physical, let's say, forms of violence that have an equally damaging impact on their participation. Okay. So some social psychological forms of violence that we can recognize. There's so many. And it depends very much on the culture of the country where the politics are happening. It depends on the role of women and the economic status of women, as well as many other factors. But some things are common. Attacks that attack a woman's dignity, that seek to shame her, humiliate her. This happens in politics all the time, right? In every country, politicians are insulting each other. This happens. But where women are involved, it tends to take on a special nature. because these attacks are often sexualized. You're accusing women, politicians in particular, of engaging in prostitution, of performing favors to achieve where they are, or the opposite. Maybe they're accusing these women of being lesbians as a form of attack. They attack the person's sexuality, in particular, where women are concerned. So this is it's a really serious issue. We've talked about family pressure, child abuse, and domestic violence, but again, there's a whole range of different types of violence that we generally don't think about, but that have a really serious impact on women's participation. So briefly about economic violence. So economic violence, what it means is refusing or denying lawful resources owed to women. So in some countries, for example, political actors may have a right to certain campaign funds, certain time with the media maybe. Maybe they have state resources allocated once they're elected to office, a desk and a secretary, or a security force person to help provide personal security. We've seen that across different countries, women can often be denied these resources in different ways, either by their parties, by the state, or elsewise, but it's because they are viewed as less, they are viewed as vulnerable, or simply because the men who control those resources don't want them to participate in politics. This is an economic form of violence. Better catch up. We've already talked about the exploitation of internally displaced people. This is also an economic impact that's very serious. Economic coercion and punishment, especially for women who are engaging in politics at the local level. Maybe in these cases, their husband or their father controls their access to money, to bank account, to credit. You see cases where men will simply refuse to give women the money they need to live or to feed their children or otherwise as a way of coercing their participation. And by coercing participation, I mean either prohibiting them, forbidding them from voting, from running for office, for being a poll worker, or trying to choose for them to make sure that they can vote more than once because they control their partner's vote, or punishing them for this type of behavior. And the last point on here is increased crime and impunity. And this could be a funny one in some cases, but this is a different impact of this violence, because in countries where elections are causing chaos, they're causing social disorder, crime also tends to increase. And this type of crime can have a differentiated impact on men and on women. For example, in some countries where I've worked, security goes down in general in the country during the election, and police forces have to send all of their forces to deal with the political problem, so general crime becomes more frequent. And in the country I'm thinking of, rape increased dramatically for women who were working in the fields, agricultural women who were working in isolated places, because there was just more impunity for it. And for a long time, people were looking at this case saying, why is rural agricultural rape cases going up during political crisis? Like, what's this connection? And we've realized that it was due to this absence, and also because spirits are tense, people are anxious, and this violence is being expressed in different ways across society, and in ways that have a very gender-specific impact. So we'll go next. Locations. I think you're starting to see a trend here, right? That the stereotypes that we have about violence and about politics, when you start applying a gender lens to them, these stereotypes change, and we can really get a lot more nuance. So where does this type of violence happen? It doesn't just happen in the street, right? It's not just assassinations and bombs and terrible things like this. It also happens in private locations, homes, churches, stores, private places. It happens in the domestic sphere. And what I mean by domestic sphere is certainly it's the bedroom, but it's also in the relationship space between a man and a woman, or an extended family, an intimate family, where this type of violence occurs. So sometimes it's psychological, sometimes it's over the phone, but this is the domestic violence. And then we'll talk about in a moment, but virtual locations for violence as well. So you can turn. So what do we mean by virtual spaces? Lots of things. The cell phone can be as dangerous as a gun in some cases. SMS messages, social media, web pages, news sites, blogs, social media, radio, television. This is not a physical space, but it's a virtual space, it's a digital space. This is another arena, it's another location where this type of violence can occur. All of these things, this is the typology continues. It's a very sad typology. Victims. Oh, I don't have that one. Hang on. One moment. We have slightly different slides. So we'll talk about, is this say victims? Okay, thank you. I'll put the English version with me too so I can follow as well. Please excuse me. No, I don't have that. Oh, no, I do. Okay. Exactly. So how do men and women compare as victims of violence? So we can see in the graph here that for both men and for women, political parties, candidate supporters, the people who are most actively engaged in politics tend to be the people that experience violence the most. That's not a surprise. But there are some surprises in this research. For example, the second bar that we see is voters, right? Sorry. And in this case, you see that female voters in this study were almost 4 times as frequently victims as men. I should specify, by the way, this data is taken from 6 countries on 4 different continents around the world. It was taken between 2008 and 2011. And so it's a small sample, but it gives some ideas of the differences. So yeah, women voters were often more frequently victims, especially women in rural locations. I thought it was interesting that when we talk about leaders and candidates, there's relatively similar proportion of incidents, but in fact, women are much fewer. There's many fewer women candidates and leaders of parties, so there's a difference impact there. In terms of journalists, although journalists represented a smaller proportion of victims of violence, females were almost 4 times again more frequently victims of violence in media. So in the next slide, you'll see the same information, slightly different, no, different slide, that's fine. Okay, anyway, it was the same slide anyhow. Perpetrators of violence. We apply a classification here as well in order to get a clearer idea, but perpetrators are really diverse as well. It's not just parties fighting each other in the streets, opposition parties getting angry at each other, hiring thugs and things like this, but it can be institutional actors. A lot of times when you're talking about violence against women in politics, you see the state security forces, the police, the armed forces are perpetrating this violence. In some cases, government institutions are involved. Poll workers are involved, very sadly, as well as gangs, militia, and other private security forces. There are also non-state political actors, as we call them, and this is what we most commonly think of when we think of perpetrators of any kind of violence. Candidates, party members, paramilitary, party militia, non-state actors. This is perhaps the most common actor, people who are engaged in politics, but it deserves to be looked at from the gender lens because sometimes the impact is really shocking. I'm thinking of one case from an interview where a female judge at the relatively high court level, she was attacked by another judge in her own court district and raped in the government building because this man was convinced that she had no place having that position. So yeah, this is a political conflict. These are political actors, but it is a profoundly disturbing form of violence that we don't talk about when we consider political conflict. And finally, and this is the one that is maybe the most overlooked when we're talking about politics and election violence, are society actors. You know, people who aren't in politics, people who aren't in government, they're not directly part of a conflict, but they're very much engaged in this type of violence. So you see journalists and media, we'll talk about it more in a moment, but they can perpetrate violence in the way that they depict men and women differently, in degrading sexual comments that they say, in sometimes making sexualized jokes that can have really damaging consequences. Community members and groups, religious leaders, as the example I talked about earlier, traditional leaders, employers, criminal actors, intimate partners and spouses, and even family members. I think the most disturbing case of this type of violence that I've ever seen in my research was involving a young woman in Afghanistan, a very violent country, of course. And this young woman was excited by the elections coming. She wanted to participate. She wanted to be a poll worker in her local polling station. So, you know, her family was resistant of this. They didn't want her to be so visible in public to men in particular, but they allowed her to go. And she did her job. But, you know, if you're working on an election, sometimes you have to work late. You have to stay until the polls close. You have to count the ballots, many things. And this girl, she had to work late one night, and she had to take a public transportation to come back to her house. She was in a taxi cab that was driven by a male driver. And her family was furious, in particular her mother-in-law, because she had exposed herself in this way, and they killed this young woman in a very terrible way, because she wanted to participate, because she was breaking the rules, because she had the courage to want to participate even in this small way, not becoming a candidate, you know. And this is a form of election violence. It's a form of political violence that we don't talk about. This young woman died. She died in her private home. It was not in the media or in the newspapers. The perpetrator, the criminal in the case, was a member of her own family. And not only did she suffer the most terrible consequences possible, but this had such a larger consequence on her community and on the quality of democracy in her community and in her country, because, thank you, it so severely limited the role of women to participate in elections as well. So, are there any questions to this so far? I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. Okay. This is perpetrators still? This is sources, yeah. Okay. So, there are so many different forms of election violence that we can see when we apply the gender lens to this. But we have to know how to apply a gender lens also. We have to have the physical research tools to do so. And so when we look at the data that we have on men and women and the violence that they experience during elections, we can find that there's really different ways that we find out about what exists, how things are happening. So in the first case today, you know, I gave you an article that was in one of the most famous French media sites, right? It's an international website. The cases of women's violence that I've talked about have come to me through private interviews for the most part. I've given you some small anecdotes from my own research. If you take this for the thousands of cases that we looked at in the quantitative study here, you'll see that the cases where women were the victims of violence, you're almost always finding out about them from community sources, right? From someone, a neighbor, or a market woman, or a religious leader, something like this, you find out, you discover, you research violence against women in politics through these type of community sources, eyewitnesses, and other face-to-face human contacts. On the contrary, if you go to the far end of the data there, these are cases that were documented by media sources, by hospital reports, by police reports, by formal public sources of documentation, okay? Is there a surprise? These are the types of violence that are happening to men. So when we find out about election violence, when we research and document election violence, if we only look at the newspapers and at the hospital reports and the police reports, we have an automatic gender bias in the type of data that we collect. So as researchers, we need to make sure that we're using a gender-sensitive way of collecting this research to find out about what is really happening for both men and for women. So this is an important thing not to forget. So the last aspect here are the impacts of this type of violence. Yeah. The impacts. So obviously we've seen it now many times in what I've been saying, but it harms the person terribly, physically, emotionally, psychologically, economically, sexually, in some cases even resulting in mortality. But it has this amplified effect. It violates the victim's civil and political rights to participate in the political process, and it also institutionalizes the victim's subordinate position in society because it excludes them through coercive means from state governance. And this is an important dimension of this type of violence to understand. It has the interpersonal impacts, but it is institutionalizing violence within a system because it is excluding an entire class of people from participating in the institutions that could change the situation in a more lasting way. So when women are being coercively, violently excluded from political life, that means that they can't go and be elected to change the laws and to increase the laws against domestic violence, to protect other women and other men from experiencing the many types of violence that we've talked about here. And that is a systemic impact of this type of violence. And this is why we care about it so much. So those are kind of the main three theoretical impacts, but there are many, many more practical, tangible impacts that this type of violence can have. So you see in cases around the world where a woman candidate will withdraw her candidacy because of threats, because of this type of violence. It makes it harder in some countries to recruit election or polling staff, fortunately not here in Ukraine. Some countries have polling stations that are closed because of it. Political party rallies and other activities that are interrupted. Postponing elections, reducing activism, changing voter preferences and even outcomes in elections, and in some cases even population displacement, where violence is having really major impacts. And so we see how damaging this type of violence is to the victims and to democracy on the whole. So that was part one. We're going to go ahead. Yeah, please go. More? Okay. So, part two. Violence against women in elections, the role of ICTs, the role of information and communication technologies. I talked about, when I was talking about the typology, please. When I was talking about the typology, the locations where violence occurs. It happens in public, it happens in private, it happens domestically, and it happens in virtual locations. The virtual locations, we've already talked about them as well. There are many. They depend in different countries on the engagement with different types of communication technologies, but they exist worldwide. Why do we care so much about this today? For one, because we're glued to our cell phones, because these communication technologies have changed how we interact with each other, they impact how we view each other, and they have really special gender implications as well. So Yeah, again, please. Okay, so you leave it there. So what is specific about technology-facilitated violence? What is specific about the digital sphere when it comes to violence against women in politics? A few things. First of all, number one is the volume, the quantity of attacks. Okay. What do we mean by this? So in the cases you saw there was 2,000 some odd individual cases of data that we tracked in violence, physical violence, other types of violence that takes place in the real world. In the digital world, in the cyber world, the volume is so much higher. Instead of one rape attack or rape threat that's coming through to a woman, we've documented cases, for example, of a British member of parliament who was receiving hundreds of rape threats and death threats per hour. Per hour. Imagine if your cell phone is beeping, beeping, beeping incessantly, and every single message is somebody that says they're going to find you and rape you, they're going to rape your daughter, they're going to kill you and your family, and over and over and over and over. So it's not only receiving the threat, but it's the amplitude of it, it's the volume of it. It's the fact that it's sometimes you don't know who these strangers are who are sending you these messages, so it's terrifying because technology makes things more anonymous. It makes it harder to recognize who is actually threatening you. Technology can facilitate this type of violence also because women in many countries have different vulnerabilities. For example, there's a gap with technology in different countries, not here in Ukraine, but women may have less access to education in general or fewer economic resources. So for that reason, they may have less access to technology. They may be less familiar with how to protect themselves, how to secure their systems and things like that. That's one. The next is the importance of morality and of ethical concerns for women. What do I mean by that? Well, I said it earlier. Moral concerns, ethical concerns. Candidates in politics attack each other all the time, but when you're attacking a female candidate or politician, it's much more likely that you'll call her a whore, that you'll call her a lesbian, that you'll say that she was performing sexual acts in order to see, to get her place. They're terrible insults, terribly, obviously, but they can have an extra impact for women because women, especially with small children, can be really sensitive to this. What mother, what good mother would want ever for her child to see her being accused of these things on television, on the phone, on the newspaper, It's disgusting, and it's impacting that individual person, but it's also impacting her family and her sense of responsibility. Because even though men and women can be attacked equally for these types of things, women still in many countries, if not most countries in the world, are the primary caregivers of their children and are held to a different moral standard in many ways. So they become more vulnerable to attacks of that nature. Also because, as we saw in the last piece, women experience psychological forms of violence much more frequently than men do, and online attacks are almost entirely, well, they are obviously entirely psychological. So it's just part of that sphere. Go ahead. One more? Okay. Images, and we'll see this in a minute. Images play an important role. We see cases around the world where people are photoshopping images. They are taking photos of women in compromising positions if they can, or changing them in order to humiliate these women again and sexualize them. Speed. These attacks occur really, really, really quickly, as opposed to other forms of violence. And they go so fast as well. If you click on something and like something and spread an aggressive, harassing, abusive message, it can impact thousands of people can see it before you can do anything about it. So it can have a really huge impact in a way that other forms of attacks can't have. There's generally impunity and a lack of regulation for these types of crime. In many countries around the world, there's a gap in the legal code for addressing this, so it makes it much more risky for people. And also because, of the anonymity of the problem, right? There's so many anonymous interactions on the internet, you can't possibly prosecute those people. And because of the nature of it. So maybe somebody put a joke, terrible joke, not illegal, about a woman being prostitute in order to run for office. And then his friend likes it. And then 10 friends like it. And then 100 and 1,000 people like it. You can't prosecute that from a justice angle so much. Every time you hit like on a Facebook page, that person is continuing and amplifying a problem that may be connected to violence, but there's not an easy, clear, traditional way of stopping it. And this is one reason that technology poses a particular threat to women. And it can also silence them for these reasons and inhibit them from trying to speak publicly because of that. So, one more. All right, so it's in English and Ukrainian, I see. Violence against women who committed through information communication technologies. So we've talked about what these attacks look like. They can include photoshopped images of women to shame them or to insult them. I already said, but ICT, information communication technology, attacks travel at very, very fast speeds. They can cause so much damage to a person's character before they can be stopped or contained. They have so much impunity because there's very little regulation in many countries. And they can also silence women from participating. So these are the specific theoretical reasons, conceptual reasons that violence that's committed through technology can have a really disproportionate gendered effect. Men experience them too, and I'm not discounting that experience, and I'm not minimizing it in any way here, but we need to recognize that women have a different experience of election violence, of political violence, and that in particular communication technologies can facilitate this in really strong ways. I'll let the translator finish. Okay. So I have a number of images to kind of demonstrate how horrible this can be. Before we go ahead, we're gonna go through them very quickly because I don't want them to stay on the screen for too long. They're deplorable. But because we do want to understand what in practice this looks like after talking about it theoretically. But we'll see in a moment that the sites that we visit the most, Facebook, YouTube, they're the scene of the crime in many places. That many actors, again, political parties, state officials, and others either use demeaning, sexualized depictions of women to insult them, to prevent them from running, to cement their role in society as lesser and as objects, and otherwise, perpetrate and continue to increase this diminished image of women in politics. So we're going to go very quickly through some of these images just so you get an idea. So please, this is a case in Israel. They've made a song with this poor girl in her small clothes. This was a screenshot taken during the American election, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, from Twitter. And I could have gone on for hundreds of pages. Hillary is a lesbian. Every woman Bill brought to the White House was for her. Or Donald Trump gets to sleep with Melania. Hillary only wishes that she could look like that. Hillary Clinton is a known lesbian. Blah, blah, blah. Hillary is a lesbian. There's so many. There's hundreds of these. And it's okay. One thing is like, oh, it's a small joke. It's stupid. But if you see thousands and thousands of these, it can have a real impact. And if your children see you attacked in this way so many times, at what time do you say, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to protect my family, I'm going to stop. I'm not going to do this to my family anymore. You're protecting your family, but your country is worse for it, and your rights have been violated. So we'll go again. Our neighbors here, they use this a lot. YouTube ads, strip for Putin, keep going. Virgins for Putin. These are real ads. You can look YouTube at your own time. Go ahead. More examples, Russia, here in the Ukraine also, in Spain, using sexual incitation to encourage people to vote. Go ahead. This one, I think, I forget, it's global. The 20 hottest female politicians around the world. Great. Let's talk about policy platforms. Let's talk about respect. No, let's talk about this. Keep going. This was from the New York Times. In Iran, made a statement, donkeys, monkeys, and women are not welcome to attend parliament. Thank you very much. Okay. I have a really long list of this. You don't need me to explain any further. You get the point. These are only some small examples of how digital technology is amplifying these messages in so many ways. There are many, many options to address this in practical terms. We've talked about research here. Our organization, the IFES, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, addresses these issues in many different ways around the world. We conduct research on it, first of all, to understand the differences, because violence is very different in every country where it occurs, including in my own, in the US. And we work around the election cycle to understand how to prevent it and stop it. So in some countries where there's a lot of physical violence and maybe domestic violence, you can offer some services. You can offer health. You can offer police protection. In other countries, we do research on social media to understand how social media is being used to damage women's participation in elections. And that enables us to come up with other solutions, including working with websites to block certain forms of content, helping women become more secure about online practices and control this type of behavior, and also how to respond to it personally. Because people who have survived this type of attack can offer lessons on how to become stronger and how to become more resilient and how to respond to it effectively, and many, many different ways. We're here today to talk in a university setting about the theory of this, but IFES is a resource here in the country. We've worked here for 20 years now, and we work actively to prevent this type of violence as well as to support political and electoral processes and human rights in many different ways. So we welcome you to talk to our offices as well to learn more about the practical steps that can be taken. But I'd like to conclude in saying that we all gain by putting a gender lens on our understanding of violence, because when we do that, we see that violence is a much more complex phenomena than we may have assumed otherwise, that it impacts men and women very differently, and that they have different needs and different roles, and that in order to really protect our democracy, to protect our country, we need to be active in all these different areas that I've talked about now in order to really help build an inclusive, participatory democracy. So with that, I'll stop, and I would love to take your questions and your comments. Thank you. That is experienced here in the Ukraine.
Well, it depends what kind of violence it happened. Well, as far as I see, the majority of the examples
For the translator.
the majority of the examples that we saw here and that you talked about probably are not so widespread in Ukraine. We have some kinds of violence against women politicians, but one of the examples can be using some insultive terminology while talking to them, trying to humiliate them, and saying that probably they use some man in their lives who help them to be promoted and, well, in their career, in their political career. Well, I think this kind of discourse is pretty popular and widespread. Well, but one of the most shocking examples for me is that the one from Egypt, where a woman, a demonstrator, was stripped in public. Well, I remember when I saw it, it really, I was shocked how it can happen, how they can show their disrespect to women in such a humiliating way. Well, in Ukraine, we like demonstrations, well, but I think such things could never happen here, hopefully.
Agree, disagree? Agree? Yeah. As I said, it's a very diverse form of violence, and it exists very, very differently according to where the country is. We're so fortunate here in Ukraine not to have the types of physical extreme violence that I talked about. I included those examples in my talk today because I think it's important to understand that they exist. But that doesn't mean that because they don't occur here, we're okay. We can close our eyes. Because this type of awareness is important. In my country, in the United States, this certainly occurs in many different ways, and women continue to feel the impact of it. Whether they're protecting their families, whether they feel that politics is a dirty, violent place that women don't want to be involved with. Oh, because of the microphone. I'm sorry. sorry. Yeah, so just to say how the violence occurs in different countries really varies very, very much. It can be harassment, it can be aggression, it can be abuse, or it can be the really strong forms of violence that we've talked about here. But it's important that we always apply a gender lens when we're looking at these things to understand how participation in politics can vary based on these gender concerns.
Well, so since the topic of our meeting is violence in social media, maybe you could talk a little bit about ways of how women can protect themselves from violence that or harassment that they can meet online. Well, or maybe their team members. Well, if to talk about a woman politician, so how can this woman protect herself from this influence of some cruel opponents that can attack them online?
Sure. Thank you. This is a great question. So many actors might be engaged with perpetrating violence, but so many actors are also engaged in preventing violence. And all of them should be engaged in preventing this type. So first of all, in the legal profession needs to consider the laws about libel, about hate speech. Any laws that protect this type of thing should be looked at from the angle of where violence takes place in technology. Those laws that control content on websites that can be offensive, abusive, violent, etc. Looking at the legal framework to make sure that it covers these types of problems, making sure that it's enforced. How? By advocating, by educating legal professionals, by tracking the court cases and following to see their results in order to see how these are being addressed in society. There are legal responses that can be taken. There are also increasing the technological capacity of people that investigate these crimes. So in my own experience, I gave a speech like this once, and then somebody had my phone number and I received some hateful threat from an anonymous phone number. I have it on my phone here. not that long ago. I went to the police because it was a bad threat. And this is in my home, this is in New Jersey, this is in the United States. And they told me, yeah, this is definitely a bad threat, it's illegal, but we can't help you because we don't have the technology to trace the phone number that sent you this threat. And that technology exists, right? It definitely exists. And so my local police force couldn't help me in that case because they didn't have the technology, they didn't know how to use the technology, they didn't think it was worth it. So that's it, nothing. Even though I think I know who sent this. Actually, I would be willing to bet some money that I know who sent this threat. Nothing to do. So resources, skills, making sure we have the technology to trace and to protect against this type of thing, that's another way of preventing it. The other is working with the potential perpetrators, right? So we've seen that in general, a lot of violence is coming between political parties. Normal. Political parties can stand up and say, no, we're not going to tolerate this, right? We refuse to. And in some countries, political parties will sign codes of conduct or internal party rules. And if a political party says very strong and very clear in their party rules that they refuse to tolerate anybody that perpetrates this type of issue, that hits like, that retweets, that shares something offensive like this online, that can help stop it. You know, leadership matters. Leadership really matters. Okay? Today, again, in the United States, there's a big scandal on the news because apparently a very high-level advisor has been very, very violent towards his two wives. And his wife just published some photos of herself today, beaten. And there's a big controversy because they say, there's a lack of leadership on this issue because they should have put their foot down and never tolerated this. It never should have gone so far. So you have to have strong leadership that says, we're not going to accept this in our teams, we're not going to accept this with our supporters. If you want to be a candidate with our party, if you do this, or if you encourage people to do this, you're out. That's strong. And also having male allies, as we say, having strong men who support their partners, who support their wives, their daughters, their sisters, to go through this together. So when anybody, a man or a woman, takes the choice to go for politics in some way, maybe being candidate, or maybe like this poor Afghan girl being just a poll worker, something small, it's a personal risk, it's a personal challenge, and it takes courage, it takes bravery, and it takes support. And bad things happen all the time. Maybe there's violence against women in politics, or maybe anything, you know? But you need a community of support when you take on such a personal challenge. And that's important here. So having families that work together to support, that recognize these problems, that recognize how problematic they can be, and work together to overcome that and support that can be very helpful. And finally, the last I would say is kind of working with yourself in some ways. Resilience is the word we hear often. There are networks of women who are running for office or who are participating in election management on Facebook, on WhatsApp. Maybe it's just friends. But having people you can turn to and say, this is what's happening to me, this is what I'm experiencing, it's terrible, I can't sleep at night because I'm getting so many threats, I have to take my child out of school because they're attacking my son because I was insulted on TV last night, sorry. You know, having a community that you can turn to help you be more resilient with these problems can also be a way of getting through it. So, you know, sometimes these are not illegal acts. There's not a legal case you can take. There's not a hospital case you can take, but you just need support. And having that awareness in a community is very helpful. Also, it can be helpful in coming up with some solutions to responding to it. Saying, oh, you know, this happened to me last year. Here's how I got through it. Or try this. Or don't say that, you know. that's also a way of getting through these things, because some problems you can't change, but you can just deal with more effectively. And those are only a few, and we're only just beginning to understand it now. But there are certainly solutions to stop this and to mitigate the impacts of it.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I would like to ask you, if possible, to elaborate on what civil society and self-governing organization can do to give you some context. In Ukraine, I hear and see now prominent journalists talking about the need to create some code of conduct, because a lot of mass media concentrate on negative news, and in general, not just about women, just to use the headlines as clickbaits, and there are no standards whatsoever. Maybe you know some effective examples of mass media, self-governing organization, or civil society campaigns in this field.
Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, civil society has a really important role to play in raising awareness of these issues, of educating, and of holding parties accountable to their promises. And they do this in so many creative and exciting ways around the world. The first step is always educating yourself. So within civil society movements, within advocacy groups, when they are setting out to define their goals or their objectives, or to review their mission statements, they should always think about gender. Whether it's this type of problem I'm talking about here today, or other gender concerns and impacts, they should always take that into consideration and see if and how it can be part of the mandate. And then to define the key messages for the context and say, okay, well, in Ukraine, we don't have so much physical violence, but you know, social media is a problem. And maybe the newspapers or something. Target your audience, target your goals, and educate, you know? Make sure that others are aware of these issues and that they see why it's harmful. So it's not only enough to say this happens, but you have to say, this is why it hurts us, this is why it's bad, this is bad for women, this is bad for men, this is bad for Ukraine, and this is why we need to change, and to have some practical solutions to offering that. So when I think about civil society advocacy, I think, always in kind of detailed steps, and things can be quite creative. In some countries, you'll see that the civil society groups are making report cards, like for school, that say A+ to this party, and then you fail to this one, and why. And they do it in colorful ways, they do it in fun ways sometimes. This doesn't always have to be such a sad, dark subject. It's also about empowerment, right? It's about democracy, it's about freedom, it's about participation, So we're talking about the negative things, but it's always important to keep the positive, inspirational things in contact as well. And to reach out across groups. I think, especially when we talk about gender, we tend to think of women. One thing, woman. But, it's so diverse. It's a country that's rich with ethnicities, with different regions, different economic levels, different abilities, people with different physical abilities as well. And everyone, this diversity is the rich part. And all of that should be taken into account when advocating and when reaching out. And I think when you build connections between groups and understand the richness of diversity, when you advocate, you can have a more effective voice.
Good afternoon. And we saw statistics of a level of violence between men and women in different countries. And I've heard about continents, but from which countries exactly your organization collects this information? And I want to hear a few countries, for example, except Egypt or Afghanistan or anything else countries?
Okay. So different answers to that. The data that I have shown you here is from an earlier research project that I conducted it was 8 elections in 6 countries. There was Burundi, Guyana, Nepal, Pakistan, and I'd have to look at my one to remember it again. It's been a while since I wrote it. But it was, and there was also, I want to say Kyrgyzstan, I'm sorry, I forget. I need to look at the document, but you can find it online. That was just one original research project. IFES, my organization, conducts research in a variety of different countries. We are more and more working on developing qualitative research in this field because, for the reasons I've talked about, you find out more about gender nuance when you're talking individually to people rather than looking at incidents in newspapers and hospital reports. We are looking at collecting research on this type of violence as it fits into kind of the broader cultural and political landscape within countries to contextualize it, because we think that violence is embedded in a broader culture. And we're also looking at collecting more and more data on online forms of violence, so just looking through social media. But we're only one of many organizations that are starting to look at this increasingly. Some organizations are trying to collect country-level data individually. It's very difficult. There's a lot of methodological challenges, a lot of debates in this field. Some political science researchers, you know, if you're a political scientist here, you're probably familiar with the many databases that exist on political conflict, on election violence, right? There's so many. And as political scientists, we use them every day. They are trying to incorporate gender lenses into what they do as well. And in their cases, it's purely quantitative data. So different fields of researchers are coming at this from different angles. I can't give you a list of countries. Many. There's no harmonized data at this point, so it would be virtually impossible to have data that you could study from, 40 different countries cross-nationally, the way that you could do that type of research on kind of standard conflict things that exist, correlates of war, others. But the resources are out there and they're growing, and there's a community of researchers that are working on this from an academic angle today as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I want to ask how women should react for the threats which they have in the internet.
How to react to internet threats?
Yeah.
Right. It depends on the type of threat, right? In the threat that I received personally, I went straight to the police, who couldn't do anything. In the face of a violent, direct threat to your person, you go to the police and you understand what the legal recourses are and you follow the justice straight, right? In many cases, again, there's not much that you can do. If you have an idea of where the threat is coming from, like it's really that party, their supporters that are perpetrating this thing, then it's a political issue, and you can try to engage with dialogue with that party to make them stop, to get their leaders to make this behavior stop. Right? Like you try to resolve the problem through negotiation. Politicians who can't resolve things through negotiations can resolve things through other ways. And so maybe you want to call them out. Maybe you want to denounce this and say, look, I have been getting 100 degrading sexual Facebook messages or whatever you have from party X, and this needs to stop, and we stand, here's our platform on gender, here's why it needs to stop, and denounce the other party. In politics, that's an option. Some people might not want to go that option. You can build a coalition of women that could support you against it. Many different ways. It depends on the type of violence, right? I'm talking about some big options. Again, as I said, there's personal ways as well of learning. In countries where maybe the capacity is less, of learning how to block certain users on Facebook and that type of thing and report them. I mean, in some of the countries where we do our work, capacity is very low. Where capacity is higher and people have really sophisticated access to digital media, I think the responses are a lot different as well. In one of the things I showed you with the picture of Egypt, there was the picture of a website where people were reporting these things. So that's interesting as well, because in that case, these people are using digital technology, cell phones, Google Maps, to report incidents of violence that are taking place and to track them on a map and to document them. And so in that case, you're having digital media being a resource to help prevent this type of violence, which is exciting as well. And there's a lot of things in that regard also. But those are just some examples. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really useful and interesting. And I want to wonderize if there are some tips for women to prevent themselves from violence in political sphere, or maybe you can give some advice.
How women should protect themselves? I mean, I've given a number of the options as well. From digital violence or from other forms of violence?
For example, for digital.
For digital. I think, again, first is awareness and knowledge. Some women and men who are receiving a lot of abuse on Facebook, on Twitter, if they're not aware of the fact that this is illegal, the fact that this is a distinct form of violence. It's not just something that's happening randomly, but like it is intentional, and they can act against it. That's an important first step, is that awareness of what the legal rights are, and the fact that this is not their fault, but that they can be proactive to it. I mean, you can't, freedom is free speech, right? And as long as free speech doesn't become hate speech and doesn't become threats of death and rape, a lot of abuse won't have a legal repercussion. So in cases where there's no legal recourse to take in hate speech crimes and physical threats and things like that, it becomes a lot more about discouraging this behavior through pressure, through coercion, through shaming the people that do perpetrate that type of thing, from negotiating with the leaders who can influence the people who are doing this type of behavior, from being strong about it as well. And I think if you've been following the Me Too campaign, this has been very empowering because there's so much shame associated with this type of attack, right? It's really embarrassing, it's shameful. And it takes a lot of courage to say, this happened to me, I experienced this. Women in politics often have a hard time saying that because they need to look strong, right? They need to be fierce, they need to be able to lead armies and able to lead countries, and so they don't want to say that, hey, somebody pinched me on the butt or somebody like grabbed me like that, It makes the power dynamic change. But that is so harmful, not only because it's inhibiting women from getting to the positions where they can lead their countries more effectively, but it discourages, it allows this behavior to go on with impunity. So, digital campaigns like Me Too are empowering because they're giving a voice to this. They're giving a shared experience. People realize this is not happening to them privately and exclusively, but that it's happening at a societal level, at a systematic level, that's having an impact on political outcomes in particular. And so when women in leadership and roles in particular are able to speak up about their experiences, they're empowering others to do the same, and that's the first step in change. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Okay, maybe one or two more, and then we're out of time.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question: how level of development in some countries, depends with level of violence against women.
How does the level of development impact the level of violence?
Yes.
It's a good question. There's not an empirical, scientific, research-based answer to that yet. Maybe you can write that paper. But from my personal experience, it doesn't, I would say, impact the level of violence so much, but I think it impacts the forms of violence and where it happens. Yeah, I mean, physical forms of election violence, happen in countries that are really in distress, countries that have really violent histories, countries that are desperately poor, things like that. Okay, but I mean, here in Ukraine, for example, the issue of domestic violence is very, very high, and this is a country that's very advanced culturally, socially, technologically, but that type of violence occurs a lot. And we don't know the political dimension of that, but we know that it's an issue. That type of issue is not tied to development in the same way that conflict is, but it just means that violence is shifting to different areas. And I think that that's what we need to look at. So, the first question we had was like, in Ukraine, there's not so much physical violence, so maybe this is more or less pertinent. I think it just means that we need to focus our attention to different areas to see where it's happening, because we know it's happening. I think the Me Too movement, again, was so powerful in the last 6 months because it demonstrated that at the very highest levels of the most developed countries, this is just such a huge, huge impact. With Me Too, in the United States, for example, US senators, US congresswomen came out to say this has been happening to us. The most famous women in Hollywood who are rich, who are beautiful, who are powerful, have this happen so much. Women in, I forget, but I think a dozen different states, legislatures in the United States, also came out and said this is happening at the state level as well. That's not a question of development. That's not a question of development. That's a question of understanding the types of violence that's happening. In that case, it's sexual assault, mostly sexual assault. It's understanding where it happens as well. In these cases, it was happening in the political offices. It was happening in the halls of Congress. And it was understanding the nature of that type of violence where it was occurring. It had nothing to do, with being an underdeveloped, poor conflict country. So my answer is no. It doesn't impact the quantity maybe so much, but it impacts the type and the nature.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to ask about your opinion on the fact that we've heard 3 questions so far, focusing on the fact that women should somehow protect themselves from violence and react to threats. And I don't want this to sound like a leading question, but do you think that the fact that we focus on this side of the question is a form of victim blaming when we put the responsibility for violence at the receiving party?
That's a great question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I interpreted these questions, from people who want to make it stop and find out what to do. So I think these questions are asked with the spirit of how do we stop it. But that said, no, it's not just up to the women to stop it, and it's not their fault at all. And we need to be careful of that type of thing, and I believe in that very strongly. I don't want to see women as victims all the time, at all. This is a conversation about empowerment. It's a conversation about transforming values. It's a conversation about men as much as it is about women. So, no, we need men to be aware of this as well and to change that behavior and to stop that behavior, to become allies, to denounce it, and to call out their brothers when they see it occurring amongst them. That's so important. We need to make sure that the legal systems and institutions in countries protect people equally And when I say equally, it doesn't mean from a blind perspective, but it recognizes the different types of violence that different people experience according to their sex, according to their sexuality, according to their religion, their race, whatever. And that it is providing protection under the law equally. And also, I mean, when I talked about the solutions that women can engage in themselves, it's also recognizing the fact that politics is still politics. Things will continue to happen, and there are certain tools that that we certainly can take ourselves to protect ourselves additionally. It's not in any way suggesting that you know, that we're inviting behavior, that we're inviting negative actions, but just that there are certain steps that people can take to do it. And sometimes the reason that those steps are not being taken are because there's a gender difference already. So like I was saying, in cases where there's a digital gap between men and women, because maybe women with less economic resources have less digital knowledge and sophistication, helping women to enhance their skills, to learn how to password protect their accounts better, or to block users, or, you know, really simple things, but helping divide that gap in technology in some cases can, you know, can be a first step as well. But no, a very good point. Thank you. Last question? Last question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm a student of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Just a question about feminism in the internet. There are a lot of people and women in this case too. In this case, when we notice in some kind of Twitter, Facebook and other network, when some kind of anonymous people, and even we don't know that is a woman or man, and then provoke some kind of cyberbullying in the internet. Should women react on such kind of feminism, and should we do something for stop such kind of cases? And thank you.
Okay, so the question is, when these cases occur, should there be a feminist response to it? Is that correct? So I mean, feminism is a term that is evolving and changing and being understood differently in different countries today. So I will speak about feminism as I interpret it. To me, feminism is recognizing the inequalities that exist in our societies based on gender differences and refusing to accept them and being proactive about changing them. So understanding them and acting. And from that perspective, I would say yes. There is a need for a feminist response, if you define feminism in this way. Why? It goes back to the very first thing I said, because this type of violence is hurting the individual physically, right? But it's hurting democracy, it's hurting freedom, it's hurting really basic principles of our society, right? And feminism is the same. It recognizes the individual harm, but it also recognizes that this harm is connected to a bigger systemic problem. So if someone is perpetrating this violence against you, you can say, you know, shut up, you're a jerk, you're a moron, cut it out. But, you know, and then it's just an interpersonal, it's a one-on-one fight. But if you say, look, you need to stop because you are committing treason against your country, because this country is based on free values, it's based on democracy, and what you are doing is silencing me, but silencing maybe my neighbor who is reading this and doesn't want the same thing to happen to her, so maybe she won't speak tomorrow. Maybe she'll teach her daughter not to speak for the same reasons. You know, you're having an impact that goes beyond the one-on-one fight. So I'm pointing, but you understand, it's not you. Yeah, what you're doing is not only attacking me as an individual, you're attacking our society, our country, our values, because you are being a part of a systemic problem. That is my definition of feminism. And that's why I would say that, yeah, no, it is important to keep that bigger perspective in mind when we talk. And I mean, we don't talk about treason and democracy every day in conversation, but it's important to have an awareness of how our individual actions, affect these bigger trends in our society. So, yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I think I've gone well over my time. I really appreciate being here today. It was such a pleasure. I hope that the lecture was helpful to you. And if you do have any questions, my colleagues are here, and I'm pretty easy to find as well. So if you'd like any more of the written research, don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you so much.